A struggling artist painted a mural for free, not knowing it would become a national landmark that would change his life forever. Miles Forrester stood before the blank wall, his paintbrush trembling slightly in his paint-stained fingers. The bitter Chicago wind cut through his worn jacket, but he barely noticed. At 34, he had long since grown accustomed to the cold, both the physical chill and the icy reality of his fading dreams. 3 eviction notices in 18 months, 2 rejected gallery submissions just last week, and now an empty refrigerator waiting in his studio apartment. Miles adjusted his woolen beanie and studied the enormous concrete canvas before him. A weathered, graffiti-tagged wall stretching across the side of an abandoned community center in one of the city's most overlooked neighborhoods. The building's owner, Mrs. Abernathy, stood beside him, her eyes hopeful despite the deep lines of worry etched around them. "I know it's a lot to ask, Mr. Forrester, especially with no payment," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter around her small frame. "But this center meant everything to this neighborhood once. Before the funding cuts, before everyone started leaving." Miles nodded, remembering the newspaper clippings she'd shown him. The community center in its heyday, children laughing on its steps, seniors gathered for weekly socials, teenage basketball tournaments that had once united the fractured community. All gone now, just like his own dreams had nearly vanished. "I understand," he said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the November air. "Sometimes the things that matter most can't be measured in dollars." He didn't tell Mrs. Abernathy about the phone call he'd received that morning, his last potential client canceling a commission. He didn't mention that painting this mural meant less time for the commercial work he desperately needed to make rent. Some truths were easier kept hidden behind a forced smile. "I'll start tomorrow," Miles said, already mentally cataloging which of his supplies could stretch across such a massive space. Not enough, certainly, but he'd figure something out. He always did. What Miles couldn't figure out, however, was why he had agreed to this project at all. Perhaps it was the genuine warmth in Mrs. Abernathy's eyes, the first person in months who seemed to truly believe in his talent. Or maybe it was simply that, after years of compromising his artistic vision for commercial clients who never seemed satisfied, he craved the freedom of a blank wall and no creative restrictions. "Paint whatever speaks to you about our neighborhood," Mrs. Abernathy had told him. "Make it something that reminds people who we are, who we were, something that gives them hope." Hope. Miles almost laughed at the irony. How was he supposed to paint hope when he could barely remember what it felt like? The next morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, a brief reprieve from the November gloom. Miles arrived early, his ancient pickup truck loaded with every can of paint he owned, brushes in various states of wear, and a few ladders borrowed from his neighbor, the only person in his apartment building who still greeted him in the hallway. He was surprised to find he wasn't alone. A teenage girl sat on the curb opposite the wall, sketchbook balanced on her knees, pencil moving in quick, confident strokes. "You the artist?" she asked without looking up. Miles set down a bucket of supplies. "Supposedly." Now she glanced up, dark eyes assessing him with the unfiltered honesty of youth. "You don't sound very sure." "Just being realistic," Miles replied, unfolding his stepladder. "What you want, What's your name?" "Zoe," she said, returning to her sketch. "I live across the street. Been watching people tag that wall for years." Miles studied her for a moment. Threadbare jeans, oversized hoodie, a face too serious for someone so young. "You draw?" She shrugged, but there was pride in the gesture. "Sometimes. Can I see?" Zoe hesitated, then crossed the street and handed over her sketchbook. Miles flipped through pages of surprisingly skilled work. Urban landscapes, faces full of character, scenes from neighborhood life rendered with raw, untrained talent. "These are good," he said, meaning it. "Really good." Something flickered across her face, pleasure quickly masked by practiced indifference. "Whatever. My mom says art doesn't pay bills." The words hit Miles like a physical blow. How many times had he heard similar sentiments? From his father, from well-meaning friends, from his ex-fiancée before she'd finally given up on him. "Your mom's not wrong," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Zoe took back her sketchbook. "So what are you going to paint?" Miles turned to face the blank wall, its enormity suddenly overwhelming. "I don't know yet." "That's a pretty terrible answer for a professional," she said, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. "Who said I was a professional?" Miles found himself smiling back, and that was how it began. Miles started working, sketching rough outlines while Zoe watched critically from her perch on the curb. By midday, an elderly man had set up a folding chair nearby, offering occasional comments. By afternoon, 2 more neighbors had appeared, bringing coffee and homemade sandwiches. "You're drawing attention," Mrs. Abernathy remarked, appearing beside him with a thermos of hot soup. "This neighborhood hasn't gathered like this in years." Miles nodded distractedly, his mind consumed with the emerging design. A stylized cityscape that morphed into human figures, their hands interlinked, creating the skyline with their bodies. Not his usual style, but something about this place, these people, was pulling different work from him. That evening, as the light faded, Miles reluctantly packed up his supplies. His fingers were stiff with cold and paint, his back aching from hours on the ladder. But for the first time in months, the heaviness in his chest had lightened slightly. "You coming back tomorrow?" Zoe asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," Miles nodded. "I'm coming back." The next day brought rain, a steady soaking downpour that made painting impossible. Miles sat in his truck, watching rivulets of water stream down the windshield, disappointment settling heavy in his stomach. He was about to drive away when he noticed Zoe huddled under the awning of a nearby convenience store, sketchbook clutched protectively against her chest. Without thinking, Miles honked his horn and waved her over. She hesitated, then dashed through the rain to his passenger door. "Want to see where the magic happens?" he asked, attempting a lighthearted tone. "My studio." My apartment." "Well, my apartment that I pretend is a studio." Zoe's eyebrows rose. "You're inviting a random teenager to your apartment? That's not creepy at all." Miles winced. "When you put it that way. Look, I thought you might want to see some finished work. But you're right, it's inappropriate." "Bad idea." "I'm kidding," Zoe said, buckling her seatbelt. "My mom works doubles on Tuesdays. She won't be home until midnight anyway." Miles' studio apartment was a study in organized chaos. Canvases stacked against walls, paintbrushes in coffee mugs, sketches taped haphazardly to every available surface. Tubes of paint-lined windowsills and a mattress on the floor served as both bed and couch. "Sorry about the mess," he said, suddenly seeing the space through a stranger's eyes. But Zoe wasn't looking at the mess. She moved slowly around the room, studying each painting with surprising intensity. She stopped before a large canvas, an abstract piece Miles had painted during the darkest period after his fiancée left, all shadowy blues and violent reds. "This one hurts to look at," she said quietly. Miles nodded. "It hurt to paint it too." Zoe turned to him, her young face suddenly serious. "Why are you doing our wall for free when you can paint like this? You should be like famous or something." Miles laughed, but the sound held no humor. "The art world doesn't always work that way. Talent isn't enough. You need connections. You need the right people to see your work. You need—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, you don't need to hear about my failures." "I don't think you're a failure," Zoe said simply. The words, spoken with such conviction, caught Miles off guard. Before he could respond, his phone rang, the ringtone he'd assigned to potential clients. "Mr. Forrester? This is Thomas Weldon from the Lakeside Hotel chain." The voice was crisp, professional. "We're looking to commission paintings for our new location downtown. Your name was recommended to us." Miles struggled to keep his voice steady. "I'm very interested, Mr. Weldon." "Excellent. We'll need to see samples, of course. And there's a tight deadline. We'd need all pieces completed within 3 weeks. Would that be possible?" 3 weeks. The same time frame Miles had mentally allocated for the mural. There was no way he could do both. "Could I get back to you tomorrow?" Miles asked, his stomach nodding with conflict. After the call ended, Miles sat heavily on his mattress, mind racing. The Lakeside Commission would pay enough to cover 3 months of rent. It could lead to more commercial work. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been desperately waiting for. "Bad news?" Zoe asked, still examining his paintings. "Good news, actually," Miles said. "A job offer. A paying one. So you're not finishing our wall." It wasn't a question. Miles ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't say that." But they both knew what would happen. What had to happen? Miles had responsibilities, bills to pay, a career to salvage. The mural had been a nice diversion, a moment of artistic freedom, but reality couldn't be ignored forever. That night, long after he'd driven Zoe home, Miles lay awake, staring at his water-stained ceiling. The sensible choice was clear. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw the community members who had gathered around the wall, bringing him coffee, watching with interest as the first outlines of his design took shape. He saw Mrs. Abernathy's hopeful expression. He saw Zoe's talent, so raw and unrefined, reminding him of his own younger self. Morning brought no clarity, only a dull headache and the weight of decision. Miles drove to the community center, intending to explain to Mrs. Abernathy why he couldn't continue the project. But when he arrived, he found something unexpected. A small crowd had gathered despite the lingering rain. Someone had set up a tarp to protect the beginnings of his mural. An elderly man Miles recognized from the day before waved him over. "We were worried you wouldn't come back with this weather," the man said, introducing himself as Mr. Washington, a 40-year resident of the neighborhood. "I just came to—" Miles trailed off as he noticed more details. Someone had brought a portable heater. A folding table held coffee and homemade pastries. And there, beneath the tarp, Zoe was carefully outlining part of his design, following the sketches he'd left behind. "What's going on?" Miles asked. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at his side. "Word's gotten around about what you're doing. People wanted to help." I might not be able to finish this," Miles admitted. "I got offered a paying job yesterday." The disappointment on Mrs. Abernathy's face was subtle but unmistakable. "We understand, Mr. Forrester. You've been very generous with your time already." Miles looked at the wall, at the faint outlines of what could be, then at the small gathering of neighborhood residents. People who had so little yet had brought him coffee and food, who had stood in the rain to protect his work. "Let me think about it," he said finally. That afternoon, Miles called the hotel chain and negotiated a compromise. A smaller commission, fewer pieces, a slightly extended deadline. It meant less money, a tighter schedule, and working nights after long days at the mural. It was, by any reasonable standard, a poor business decision. But the next morning, when Miles returned to the wall with his supplies and announced he would be continuing the project, the cheer that went up from the gathered neighbors made something long dormant stir in his chest. Days stretched into weeks. The mural evolved, growing more complex and ambitious than Miles had initially planned. What had begun as a stylized cityscape became a vibrant tapestry of neighborhood life. Faces of actual residents appeared in the design, their stories woven into the larger narrative of community and connection. Word spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. A local blog featured the work in progress, then a small newspaper. People began coming from other parts of the city to watch Miles' work, many staying to share stories about the neighborhood's history, which Miles incorporated into the expanding mural. Through it all, Zoe was a constant presence. Miles began teaching her techniques: proper brush handling, color theory, perspective. She absorbed everything with fierce concentration, her own style developing alongside her confidence. "Why are you helping me?" she asked one afternoon as they mixed paints. Miles considered the question. "Because someone should have helped me when I was your age. Because talent deserves nurturing. Because you remind me why I started painting in the first place." The hotel commission pieces were completed in late-night sessions, Miles working under bright lamps until his vision blurred. They were good work, technically proficient, aesthetically pleasing, but lacked the soul he was pouring into the mural. The hotel manager accepted them with polite enthusiasm, paid promptly, and mentioned possible future commissions. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Miles found himself increasingly drawn to the wall, to the community that had formed around it, to the act of creation unfettered by commercial constraints. As December arrived with its first snowfall, the mural neared completion. What had once been a blank, graffiti-covered wall now told the story of a neighborhood, its past glory, present struggles, and hope for renewal. Miles had woven in references to local landmarks, included portraits of longtime residents, and hidden small visual stories throughout the massive piece. On the day Miles planned to apply the final touches, he arrived to find the street transformed. Strings of lights had been hung. Tables loaded with food lined the sidewalk. Someone had set up speakers playing music. It looked like the entire neighborhood had turned out, despite the cold. "Surprise!" Mrs. Abernathy called, approaching with a mug of hot cider. "We couldn't let you finish without a proper celebration." Miles stood speechless, overwhelmed by the scene before him. Mr. Washington clapped him on the shoulder. "You've done something special here, son. Brought life back to this corner." "I just painted a wall," Miles protested, his voice rough with emotion. "You did a lot more than that," Zoe said, appearing beside him. She handed him his favorite brush, the one with the handle worn smooth from years of use. "You showed up. Every day you showed up." As dusk fell, Miles added the final strokes to the mural, while neighbors watched, their breath visible in the cold air, faces illuminated by string lights in the warm glow of community. When he finally stepped back, brush lowered, a strange silence fell over the gathering. The completed mural was unlike anything Miles had ever created. More vibrant, more honest, more alive. It wasn't perfect. He could see technical flaws, places where his execution hadn't matched his vision, but it pulsed with an energy his gallery submissions never had. The silence broke with applause, then cheers. Someone pushed a plate of food into his hands. Another person offered congratulations. Miles moved through the impromptu celebration in a daze, unable to fully process what had happened over these weeks. How a project taken on out of desperation and kindness had somehow rekindled something he'd thought lost forever. Later that evening, as the gathering continued around him, Miles found a quiet moment with Mrs. Abernathy. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me this wall." She smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "I think this wall gave something to you too, Mr. Forrester." Before Miles could respond, a woman he didn't recognize approached them. She was sharply dressed, with an expensive camera hanging around her neck. "Mrs. Abernathy," the woman said warmly. "The mural is even more impressive than you described. Mr. Forrester, this is Elaine Mercer," Mrs. Abernathy said. "She's from the Chicago Tribune." Miles straightened, suddenly conscious of his paint-splattered clothes and unkempt hair. "I'm doing a feature on neighborhood revitalization projects," Elaine explained. "When I heard about what was happening here, I had to see for myself." She gestured toward the mural. "You've created something extraordinary, Mr. Forrester. Would you be willing to answer a few questions for my article?" The story ran the following Sunday. A full-page spread with photographs of the mural, quotes from neighborhood residents, and a profile of Miles that painted him not as a struggling artist, but as a visionary who had helped revitalize a forgotten community. 3 days later, Miles received a call from a gallery that had previously rejected his work. Then another, then an email from a major arts foundation. The mural had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the neighborhood. Winter gave way to spring. The community center secured funding for renovations, inspired in part by the attention the mural had brought. Tour buses began, including the site on their routes through the city. Art students came to study Miles' techniques. And always, there were ordinary people who simply stood before the wall, finding something of themselves in its sprawling narrative. Miles continued to paint, but differently now. His new works carried the same authentic energy he'd discovered while creating the mural. Gallery showings followed, then a prestigious award, then museum acquisitions. On the 1-year anniversary of the mural's completion, Miles stood before it with Zoe, now his official apprentice. The wall had weathered its first year well, the special sealants Miles had applied protecting the vibrant colors from the elements. "Did you ever imagine this would happen?" Zoe asked, gesturing not just to the mural, but to the revitalized community center behind it, to the new businesses that had opened nearby, to the small plaque that had been installed describing the artwork's significance. Miles shook his head. "Not even close." "Are you glad you didn't take that full hotel commission?" Miles laughed. "Best bad business decision I ever made." Later that afternoon, as the neighborhood gathered once again to commemorate the mural and its impact, a government official arrived with unexpected news. The artwork had been selected for designation as a cultural landmark, ensuring its preservation and officially recognizing its significance to the city's artistic heritage. As cameras flashed and reporters asked questions, Miles found himself thinking of that first day, standing before a blank wall with nothing but doubts and dwindling supplies. How close he had come to walking away. How easily this could never have happened. After the ceremonies and speeches, Miles slipped away from the crowds to stand alone before his creation. The setting sun cast a golden light across the wall, bringing different elements of the mural into prominence than those visible in daylight. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find Mrs. Abernathy, leaning more heavily on her cane than she had a year ago, but with the same warmth in her eyes. "You know what I see when I look at this?" she asked. Miles shook his head. "I see a man who painted himself back to life," she said softly, "and brought a neighborhood along with him." Miles swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. He thought of the artist he'd been before, technically skilled but hollow, creating work that pleased others but never touched his own soul. He thought of empty apartments and rejection letters, of giving up and giving in. And he thought of how the simple act of showing up day after day to paint a wall for free had somehow saved him in ways no paid commission ever could have. "A national landmark," he murmured, still unable to fully believe it. Mrs. Abernathy smiled. "Some things aren't meant to be measured in money or recognition, Mr. Forrester, but sometimes the world surprises us and offers those things anyway." As twilight deepened around them, Miles watched neighborhood children playing near the mural, their movements cast in silhouette against his creation. One small girl stopped to trace a painted figure with her finger, her face lifted in wonder. In that moment, Miles understood with perfect clarity what his art teacher had tried to tell him years ago. That true art wasn't about technical perfection or commercial success, but about connection. Between artist and viewer, between past and present, between individual and community. A struggling artist had painted a mural for free, and in return, he had received everything that truly mattered.